Okay, so today's topic is an introduction into the philosophy that we study here in the Gnostic school, an introduction into the so-called tradition or the foundations of the tradition. You can also call this, this is part of a block of lectures that I'm calling Introduction to Gnosis, right? And so today's lecture is entitled Gnosis, the Occult Tradition. First, I'll begin by explaining what the word Gnosis is, right? So the word Gnosis comes from the Greek language, and it literally means knowledge, right? Practically speaking, it is a type of practical knowledge that when one receives, it leads to wisdom. Okay, so it is not just information or intellectual information. It is a type of knowledge that brings about wisdom. In the same way that when you learn something intellectually, when you put it to practice and then you learn how to do that, that gives you an experience of being, right? And so then that becomes knowledge, we can say. That becomes wisdom. So this is how we, this is one of the meanings of the word gnosis, okay? But also, as we will explore today, gnosis is we can say a way of living. It is a state of being. Okay? It is a doctrine that is most famously known or that originated as Gnosticism in the first couple of centuries of our time, right? With a type of philosophy that a type of spiritual philosophy, spiritual practice that originated with the teachings of Jesus the Christ. Okay, not a religious idea or religious in a dogmatic way, I would say, but more from a spiritual perspective. Okay? And so this gnosis or this knowledge can be seen throughout history, influencing the greatest minds in history. So if we do a thorough study of history's most influential minds, okay, people that have revolutionized or changed the course of history in the fields of science, philosophy, architecture, we will begin to notice that all of these great souls were in touch, and some of them deeply in touch or part of certain esoteric schools, or what has been known as mystery schools, okay, or esoteric schools, or secret societies, whatever you want to call them, right? So if we look at the lives of history's most influential people, like we'll see, like Newton, Paracelsus, Einstein, they all had they either belonged to a type of esoteric school or mystery school, or some of their ideas or their way of thinking was influenced by the philosophies that came from these so-called mystery schools. Okay, and so what is the purpose, first of all, of these so-called mystery schools, or any spiritual school, and the purpose of a Gnostic school? Okay? And so the purpose of a Gnostic school, or a school that teaches spirituality, is to assist the student in reawakening the spiritual powers lay asleep within his or her soul. Okay, so of course we start right away from the perspective that we are spiritual beings having a human experience, right? Or that we are beings that have at least three aspects. We have a physical aspect, or let me start from the beginning. We have a spiritual aspect, which is our most pure and most original state of being. We have a soul or consciousness or psychology, and we have a physical aspect. Okay, and so the physical body and the physical personality is an expression of our spiritual nature. Okay, and then the soul, or the psyche, from the Greek word psyche, which means soul, is the mediator between the spirit and matter. Okay, and so what we express here in the physical world, hey Samir, welcome. What we express here in the physical world are values that come from the spirit world. Okay. Now, of course, later on we're going to talk about the duality, because as we will explain, or as we can see in society, our society is not really, I'm not going to say built, but the common values upon which most of us as a society rest our perspective about the universe is not really from a spiritual perspective. It's comes from a more of a materialistic point, okay? And so this is because our psyche, our psychology has been conditioned or disconnected from our spiritual nature, okay? And so all of the impulses and the life that comes from the spirit world is somehow distorted, okay, and expressed in the physical world as a distortion of the reality, okay? And so the purpose of all of these initiatic schools of mysteries is to help us as souls regain first our regain connection and identification with our true origin, with our spiritual nature, with our cosmic universal nature, and to allow us to develop that spiritual nature, okay? And that implies obviously a psychological work, and the work with what we call the psychological ego, okay, which is the conditioning. Okay? The ego is basically a programming that was brought onto the soul to see life in a different way, to see life in a way that is not from a universal cosmic perspective. Okay? And this is why we have so much suffering in the world, right? The ego is the root of all suffering. The ego in the form of my desires first, right? My way first, etc. And so it creates a self-centered perspective, a self-centered way of being, and this, of course, does not allow life to flow freely in harmony to set upon the earth and the planet. Okay? And so, like I said, the purpose of these mystery schools has always been to assist us in reawakening that spiritual nature, connecting with that spiritual nature, and of course, first of all, realizing that we have spiritual nature, because we have degenerated so much from a spiritual point of view that we have lost this perspective that we are spiritual beings, right? So this is why we have religions that come into place to try to explain to us that, hey, you know, you are not just an intellectual animal like psychology tells us, right? We are beings that have a spiritual nature, a transcendental nature. We're here temporarily, and so whatever you do now is important because that's going to impact, right? Not only the quality of your life, obviously, but what happens to you as a soul when you decide to leave this physical body. Okay? And so, sorry, I'm a little dry today. All right, so the means. So all of the different schools of thought, spiritual schools, obviously have a way of teaching, right? And this has always been referred to as initiation. Okay? And initiation is nothing other than a preparation, an education. Okay? And so in the same way that we all receive an education to move ourselves in this culture that has its own ways of being, its own laws, its own codes of ethics, we can say. In the same way, there are also things that we have to know when it comes to our spiritual nature, right? So we can say that the job of culture or the establishments that are set by culture are meant to help you educate yourself as a personality, as a person, to help you move in the physical world, okay? And there is a knowledge that is needed for us to learn how to move ourselves and to grow as souls, right? So we have the first types of schools that teach you how to grow as a personality, as a person, and then the other one that is the one that teaches you how to grow as a soul, as a spirit. And as a matter of fact, when we actually begin to study history from an esoteric point of view, we begin to see that actually the external schools, like I was saying before about religion, the external schools are an introduction into that knowledge. So our regular schools, college, the education that we receive is really meant to make you think and question life in a way that's going to allow you to get to understand your core self, to get to that, right? And so in the we'll call them exoteric schools, and the word esoteric means internal, something that is within, and so the word exoteric is the external aspect of the teachings. And so in a religious way, the external school is a school that allows you to have, that gives you hints, that gives you an introduction into what you could be, and then it's up to you to develop it, right? It's up to you to connect with that inner nature, okay? And this is why we see all around history, all around our society, if we begin to pay attention to the architecture, to the myths that we were told since we were kids, we begin to see that there is a universal and underlying truth among all of the different myths that we heard as a child, coming from different cultures and different traditions, right? The architecture that we see in Washington, D.C. has signs, has symbols that date back to the Egyptian times, right? And even our own religions, our own, if we were brought up as a Catholic or as a Christian or as a Buddhist or as a Muslim, they all seem to have the same core values within, right? And so in Gnosis, we try to focus on that because we know that there is this universal truth, okay? And so this is why Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist, comparative mythologist, says, it has always been the prime function of mythology and rite or ritual to supply the symbols that carry the human spirit forward in counteraction to those constant human fantasies that tend to tie it back. Myth is the secret opening through which the inexhaustible energies of the cosmos, or your spiritual nature, pour into the human culture manifestation. Okay, so he's saying that culture is the expression of spirit. Okay, culture, and through symbolism, through myth, men and women have tried to convey a truth that is beyond anything that we can conceive of or speak about intellectually with our limited concepts. Because our own nature is beyond concept. Our own nature is beyond mind. And so how can we explain, right, our atemporal, timeless, limitless state of being? Okay, we can use words to kind of give us a hint, to give us an idea of what that is, but it really is a matter of personal experience. And so myths have that purpose, to help you move and try to explore and go deeper into what is, right? And not take reality in the way that it has been presented to you, or assume that what you're seeing is reality, because there could be much more to it that we're not able to perceive, that because of our perception, because of our concepts, right? And as a matter of fact, I'll take a quote from Isaac Newton, who said, "Truth is the offspring of silence and unbroken meditation." Okay? Which is very interesting, because he says that truth, reality, our experience of reality, is not dependent upon our ability to physically see and study nature, but rather a preparation or a state of being that one acquires, and that allows you to experience the truth, to connect with that underlying truth. Okay? And so in the book, The Secret History of the World, by Mark Booth, he proposes that all of the theories that we know about life, about that influence the minds of all of these great artists and architectures, they linked to particular states of being brought about by esoteric practices. So he says, to quote, he says, "It might not be that genius is close to madness, but rather that genius is close to esoteric alternate conscious states of being. I'm totally messing up this quote. Let me just get it right here. Where is it? Okay. This is choosing to just act very slow right now. All right. Well, basically, his idea is that due to certain altered states of consciousness, certain people in history have come up with certain ideas, okay, which now actually science is kind of corroborating, okay, and so basically what we're saying is that the minds of the minds that have changed the course of history have been influenced by not only these teachings but by the practices, okay, that these esoteric schools have given to them, and that the truth is a matter of raising the vibration of your consciousness to open your perceptions to something more. Okay? So this type of knowledge doesn't tell you or doesn't invite the student to say that they're that their concepts are wrong, but rather that we have an incomplete perspective or experience of reality. So that we only live and we only experience a very limited aspect of reality. Okay? And in order for us to experience life in its totality, we need to go through a special training. We need to have special practices. Okay? And some of these practices include meditation, prayer, which is why these two practices are really at the foundation of pretty much every single religion in the world. Right? That wants to give you the ability to have a personal encounter, personal experience with divinity or God. Okay? And so this is all part of what we call the initiation, right? It's an education, and these schools of mysteries or this philosophy uses the four sciences that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, or what we call the four pillars of Gnosis, which are science, philosophy, art, and mysticism, okay? Which are the four pillars of the truth, the four pillars of Gnosis, okay? And so through that, we begin to experience, to get close to the truth, okay? And so initiation, in the words of Rafael Vargas, is the intimate process by means, hey guys, all right. So initiation is the intimate process by means of which the will of the divine, which dwells within each one of us, puts pressure on the human psyche or the soul with a very defined purpose, the achievement of our self-realization. Okay, so what does this mean? Basically, what this means is that your higher aspect, divinity, God within you, begins to push you to begin to question everything, to begin to question life. And this is what we call, or we can say that this brings forth what we call spiritual yearnings or spiritual inquietudes, okay, which I'm sure we all have, and this is why we're here, trying to know more about this, right? And so basically your spirit was here experiencing life, and now your spirit wants to move on to the next phase, right? Which is to grow, to know more, to re-encounter or allow you to become conscious of your spiritual nature. And so your being, or God within you, that spiritual essence or divine essence within you begins to move you, begins to start or kickstart this love for wisdom, which is philosophy, and then you start questioning at some point in your life, who am I? What am I doing here? Where am I going? What is this all about? Is there a meaning to life? Right? And so that philosophical nature puts you on a quest towards the truth. It puts you on a path. Okay? And that is the initiatic path. So your being, your divinity, your eternal divinity, is trying to put you on the path of self-realization. The word self-realization comes from the Buddhist tradition, the Eastern traditions, which is all, it literally means the development of all of your human and divine abilities. Okay, and so this is obviously you can see now where psychology is born, because we want to study ourselves, and it's of course the result of philosophy. And so let's see how Gnosticism has influenced culture. Okay, so Gnostic influences. We can see that Gnosticism, and again, Gnosticism or Gnostic knowledge is this universal type of knowledge, okay, that exists at the core of all of the different spiritual traditions. Okay? This is why Samuel Veror says, Gnosis is a very natural functionalism of the consciousness, a philosophy perennis et universalis, which means it's a universal perennial philosophy. It's a philosophy that is within, or is at the core, or gave birth to every single tradition that we know. So all of the different spiritual traditions and religions have the same core teaching. And where does that core teaching come from? That core teaching comes from the universal consciousness, or God, right? And this is why he says that Gnosis is a natural functionalism of the consciousness. Gnosis is an inner state of being that expresses itself in the form, and in different forms, right? Like Joseph Campbell says, that it expresses itself with a particular language, with a particular way of being, according to the time and place in which it needs to express itself. And so this is why in the Rig Veda, for instance, they say the truth is one, and the sages speak of it in many names, right? And so we see that the Gnostic principles really have grown in the wisdom of all ages. Okay? And so we can begin to see, if we begin to pay attention to our society, we can begin to see the Gnostic influence, or this universal esoteric knowledge influencing society today. We can look at, like I said, philosophy, for instance, which was a spiritual practice, really, that now turned into the science called psychology. Astrology is what we now call astronomy. Oh. Yeah. What? Hello. Anywhere you like. Sit front row right there. I won't pick on you. Okay. And so we can begin to see that, like I said before, all of the greatest minds in history that have changed the course of history and has influenced us form part of this type of esoteric knowledge. Okay, we have people like Newton, which I was saying before, Paracelsus, Tesla, Copernicus, Einstein, Carl Jung, Giordano Bruno, Darwin, who was actually a botanist and a theologian, not really a scientist per se. Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, etc. All of those guys that have, gave in their 5 cents into building the type of society that we have now, they all either form part of a mystery school or took ideas from these mystery schools and took those ways of thinking and some practices that allow them to get in touch with those ideas that revolutionize the world, right? And so, again, going back to that quote by Isaac Newton, truth is the offspring of silence and unbroken meditation. So it is almost as if we can really see that everything that we have here, or all of the greatest inventions in human history, are the result of what Mark Booth says, an altered state of consciousness. Okay? They are ideas that come to you when you alter your consciousness, when you become more receptive to something else, to something bigger, something new, right? And so we see that astrology, for instance, which is an ancient practice, an ancient, even spiritual practice, has become astronomy. Okay? Alchemy became chemistry, and Newton considered himself an alchemist, actually. he wanted to turn base metals into gold, right? But that is not just an external physical discipline, but is rather everything has an occult aspect or a spiritual nature. And what that was implying was that in the same way that we take gross metals and turn them into higher metals, we should take our own personality, okay, which represents the lead, or the lead of the personality, and turn it into gold, okay? And so we can transform the materialistic, gross, ignorant personality into the golden type of personality, the person or the soul that knows, right, into knowledge. We see mysticism or quantum physics being the result of mysticism. And if you've paid attention to quantum physics, they really have a lot of concepts or way of thinking that the ancient mystics have. And just to give you an example, quantum physicists now say that we live in a universe that is at least 11 dimensions. Okay, so we have a 3-dimensional aspect to this reality, it's a 4th, a 5th, all the way up to the 11th. Okay, and even 13 dimensions. But that after the 11th dimension, their math seems to trickle back down into 11 dimensions. So they're really saying that there are more dimensions, but they can only prove mathematically up to an 11th dimension. This is something that Michio Kaku has said, a famous scientist from the New York City University. And interestingly enough, if we begin to look into ancient cultures and their description of the universe, we actually begin to see that the Mayans, for instance, believe that the universe has 13 dimensions. We see that the Kabbalistic traditions, a tradition that was born from the Jewish tradition, they say this. We have a poster there, a map of. Some of you might be familiar with that. It's referred to as a tree of life in Kabbalah. And they say, the Kabbalists said that through meditation, they were revealed that the universe has 13 dimensions. Okay? It's interesting that now science is kind of corroborating that, right? All spiritual traditions tell us that there is a universal consciousness, a one consciousness, Christ consciousness, a oneness, right? And quantum physicists are now talking about the quantum field, which they say that the quantum field shapes or dictates what happens in the physical world, and that atoms actually react to an observer. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but I'll suggest you guys look into something called the double slit experiment on YouTube. There's like a 4-minute video about it, okay? Or look up Dr. Quantum and you'll see it. Well, basically, quantum physics is saying that when we begin to look into matter, into the atoms, the particles that make up what we know as matter, we begin to see that at the core, we don't find anything solid to begin with. We only find energy and light. And we see photons or particles of light that don't move around in time and space in a mechanical way, as we have thought, right? But rather that when we take a photon in a laboratory and we do certain experiments with it, the photon, that particle of light, begins to act differently when scientists are observing it directly or when they're not observing it, okay? And it's kind of hard to explain just like that, but in YouTube they have a very nice video with an explanation, an illustration of why they came to this conclusion, right? But in essence, what they found out is that atoms, the smallest particles of matter, atoms which are not atoms anymore, they're photons or quarks, they tend to actually behave in unpredictable ways, right? So it's not mechanical in nature, like we've thought. Like, you know, if you have an apple and you drop it, it's going to fall straight down, right? What they're saying is that there are many possibilities now. There are endless possibilities of what that apple can actually do. And your observation of that apple falling influences how that apple will behave, or all of the particles in that apple, right? So anyway, very interesting stuff. And so all of this new way of thinking is the direct result of spiritual thought, of esoteric thought. Okay? We can see in art that all of the myths that we have been taught since early childhood, since we grew up, they all have interesting, similar meanings. They all have, they all have similar symbols that kind of say the same thing, right? If we do a thorough study of the different myths, we find, for instance, that the story of the Christ is not unique to the Christian religion or the Catholic religion, right? We can see that that myth came from an earlier myth, which was the myth of Mithra, right? Which was born on the winter solstice, and also died and resurrected after 3 days. We see this also in the story of Quetzalcoatl in the Mayan civilization in Mexico. They had a prophet, a master that died and was crucified. And when the Spaniards came from Mexico, they actually saw that they also had a god that was crucified. And you can see the paintings. Actually, this is one of the representations of him. It's called also Kukulkan, the one who was born from fire and water. In the same way that Jesus tells Nicodemus in the Bible that unless a man be born of fire and water, he will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And so we can see that the myths that we have been told, the stories that we have been told, hide a deeper meaning that one has to know how to interpret. And once you begin to study the language of the mystery schools, you can begin to decipher those myths. Okay? In the Zohar, it says, the narratives of the doctrine are its cloak. The simple, meaning the non-initiated or the non-educated, look only at the garment, that is, upon the narrative of the doctrine. More they do not. The instructed, however, see not merely the cloak, but what the cloak covers. Right? And then Jesus in the Bible, in Matthew, says, it has been given, he was talking to his disciple, he says, it has been given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom. But to them, referring to the other people that were not close to him, but to them it has not been given. I speak to them in parables. Right? This is why they speak to us with little stories, with little fairy tales. Because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor they understand. And in them the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled, which says, hearing you will hear and you shall not understand, and seeing you will see and not perceive. For the hearts of this people have grown dull. Their ears are hard of hearing, and their eyes they have closed. Lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears. It's like an invitation to become conscious, bring more awareness. Lest they should understand with their hearts and turn so that I should heal them. Right? And then he says, but blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For assuredly I say to you that many prophets and righteous men desireth to see what you see, and did not see it, and to hear what you hear, and did not hear it. Right? So it's very interesting, that passage of the Bible from Matthew 13, 11, 17, because what Jesus is saying is basically that my teachings are understood by you because I have initiated you into my mysteries. But to those outside, they don't really know the language. So it's almost as if there is this universal occult language that we all need to begin to understand so that we can begin to tap into this universal knowledge. Okay? And so we can see, for instance, in architecture, Washington, D.C., the founding fathers, right? As we know, most of them, if not all of them, were Masons or belonged to this not secret society, but this esoteric brotherhood called the Masonic Lodge, right? And there they have a myth highly linked, or they say that their origins come from the Egyptians. And so this is why in Washington, D.C., we have one of the most prominent symbols in Washington, D.C. is the obelisk, which is a direct reference to the Egyptian influences, right? Because that's where the obelisks come from, right? And if you study the architecture of Washington D.C., you'll be blown away by how much symbolism that city was built on. The streets, you can see pentagrams, you can see cubes, you can see even a tree of life laid down when you begin to trace lines in specific circles. Let's look at the dollar bill, for instance, right? We see the number 13 everywhere. 13 stripes, 13 colonies from the beginning, 13 stars here and there, 13 arrows in the hand of the eagle, 13 arrows, and then the olive leaves. All of that is very symbolic. And all of that is Masonic language, Masonic symbolism, right? Now, you might say, well, so what? It's just symbolism. But when you think about it, you begin to see that it's important for you to know. Why? Because these people that know about all this symbolism and are connected with this secret knowledge are the ones that are making the laws in our society. So they govern politics and religion, right? And so if you want to understand the core values of a society, you have to begin to look into symbolism, into esoteric symbolism, and why most of at least all of the first few presidents of the United States were all Masons. All of the, in the history of the United States, with the exception of maybe 3 or 4, they were all Masons. They all belonged to this esoteric school. And now, here's an interesting thought. If when they enter this esoteric school, they swear, they make an oath to that lodge to say that they will commit to pursuing the goals of that society, then do you really think they have your best interest in hand? I don't need to get all like conspiracy theories here, but it really begs the question, right? Do they have the interest of the people that are out of those societies at hand or not, right? Yes, question.
Are you aware of a goal that these esoteric people have for humanity? That they're creating society around a certain set of teachings, right? That they have like that there's an end point for human civilization, that it will all be worth it. Where because like if they believe in such like truth and they're putting us into like spiritual darkness, do you think that the end point will be good for humanity rather than end in destruction?
Right. Well, a couple of things. First, I believe that all of these societies were born with that universal principle of wanting to teach all of its members and society to develop themselves spiritually. Okay, whether they still do that, that's another question. You're asking me personally, I'm not sure. I cannot say that the Masons or the Rosicrucians or the Catholics or any type of established institution is actually being very successful at doing that. Okay, but the way to actually see that is to actually see the fruits of their teachings, to see the fruits of their actions, right? I would say that originally the intent of the founding fathers was very different than the one that we have now, or what we have seen. So it almost seems as if maybe that movement was infiltrated by a more dark or sinister or ignorant philosophy, okay? And so that all serves a purpose in the path of the soul, though. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, but what if they are like aware they use both light and dark to sort of like push them against each other to create a solution, but they need to use darkness now, like it was intentional because they know that it's necessary to use
to kind of create a contrast
chaos in order to create order later.
Right.
And that like they need to like take the current system to its logical conclusion, and then after they'll create a new system from the ashes of the old society.
Yeah, that's a way of looking at it. I don't agree that we have to go through that. I don't agree that you have to actually create pain, people, and suffering just to teach a lesson. You know, because that's kind of what you're saying. That like it's almost a necessary evil kind of thing. I don't think that's the purpose. Again, I don't think that was the purpose of the original teachings of all of these schools. But rather to actually rise us from our ignorance, to rise us, to allow us to rise from our own darkness, from our own incomplete way of seeing reality in the world around us, right? And so the only reason that I really bring this up is for us to become conscious of that, right? That all of us have been taught the people that we are now, the person that we are now, is the result of what? Of culture, okay? Whether that's a positive or a negative thing, I'll allow you to reflect and meditate on that. My conclusions is that the way that we have been raised has not allowed us to actually explore ourselves in more profound ways. Okay, and this is why this knowledge is kind of re-emerging, because we can say that this knowledge always emerges in different forms, and that knowledge is also taken by certain people that are not, that don't have enough knowledge and degenerate the knowledge. So we can say that every single institution, eventually, even if it begins with the seeds that allow the human spirit to move forward, like Joseph Campbell says, eventually degenerates with time, because as we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, there are religious principles and religious forms. And the religious principles are universal, and they're always, they're universal. And the religious forms are not universal. Religious forms are ways of teaching that universal principle to a particular group of people, right? This is why the truth is one, but we see that in India, they have a way of expressing that truth with their own language, with their own symbols, something that relates to the needs of the people of that space. And then in Europe, we have another religious form. But the religious principle is what's important. So at the very core are the Gnostic influences, or that universal knowledge can be found at the core of all of the different cultures, spiritual traditions, and even societies. But somewhere along the line, those principles are distorted in a way, right? And so, like Jesus says, you will know them by their fruits. So let's study, let's observe, let's meditate upon the fruits of this society, of this culture, and see whether this culture seems to be in touch with that transcendental principle of love, of respect for life, right? So, all right. So we'll leave it at that. Yes. Thank you. Do you guys have any questions, comments? Sure.